Hi everyone. I've enjoyed being a member of this book club for a very long time, and it's a privilege for me to be here talking to you today about a subject that I find very interesting, writing about partition. So today, three things basically. What do you think about and what do you feel when you hear the word partition? And then when you read about partition, read partition literature, what exactly are you reading? When you write about partition, what are your challenges? And then I'm also, along with these three, in each one, I'm going to try and give you some of my insights and share some of the stories that I've learned. And of course, it didn't actually start with violence. It started with an idea, a proposition, something being put on the table, being discussed, negotiations. And then, of course, we came to a point where a line was drawn. And as we all know, it was done in so much haste. There just wasn't enough time given to it. There wasn't enough thought given to it. And very often we blame that lack of thought and lack of preparation for the terrible things that happened later. Next, of course, is the division of assets. And dividing things between Pakistan and India was one, but I've also heard from a lot of people that when they were leaving their homes, they could not take what was theirs. At the borders, they were checked, and they were called smugglers if they were carrying money and gold. So, that was also a big issue. Not as bad as this. The worst thing that happened in partition is that lots of people were killed. And this is, I think, in Calcutta. That's corpses. I don't know whether you can see this photo clearly. Corpses, and there's vultures on the roofs. The homes are all abandoned. People are all dead. Terrible things happened to women during partition. They were abducted, they were raped, their children were snatched away, they were used as instruments of torture for their families, and they were forced to jump into wells, supposedly to save their family's honor. And there are so many cases of women who were rescued and restored to their families, and then they were rejected by their families because of the experiences that they'd been through. Now, the thing that we need to look at, especially here, is that these stories about the women, they came out, the first major work, Urvashi Bhuttalia's The Other Side of Silence, it was published in 1998, more than 50 years after partition. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to say today, that such a terrible thing happened that we didn't even realize. And looking at things in the context of today, we have so many more things to learn. So this was the displacement, which is another very strong aspect of partition. And it's horrible losing your home. It's horrible having to flee. But when you think about it as a migration, as leaving something for something better, there are positive aspects to it. And then when you get over this phase, this horrible phase of having nothing, relying on others, just not knowing what's going to happen next. And then you start working, using whatever energy you have, use your enterprise, and then things do get better. And that's an important part of the partition story, which hasn't really been told or explored. About a year before, I actually thought about writing about partition, and that's a Facebook post I made. So this is 2011, which is 8 years ago, and it just happened that by then I was at an age when I could think philosophically, and I was thinking about my grandparents. So we celebrate Independence Day, and it's this great day for the country. But I started thinking about what it was like for my grandparents who left everything. And I said this on Facebook, and you can see that it was a long time ago, so not too much activity, but people were squabbling. And just that small comment which I made, there were all these controversial remarks, and it was very confusing. And I also got a private message from someone which said, Saaz, with all due respect, time we forgot those memories. They don't let us go forward. It's time we buried hate, which is redundant. And I found that really upsetting because there was nothing about hate. I hadn't been talking about hate at all. I was thinking about my grandparents and the fact that they went through a difficult time during their lives. And in a way, I was admiring the way they coped with it, the way they moved forward without, pretty much seamlessly, I think. It must have been extremely difficult for them, so it must have taken a lot of strength. I also did feel at that time, and I still do feel, a little guilty that because I lived with my grandparents for 3 years when I was going to college. And I never, at that time, it never struck me that there were these people who had been through such a big trauma and displacement. They were very well integrated, and there was nothing, at that time, I just wasn't interested in their previous lives, and I regret that now. So there was a bit of guilt also in this. But this thing about trying to talk about it and first of all, entering into some kind of controversy and then being told by someone, listen, let's not talk about that. Let's not start that all over again. That was quite interesting. Okay, can you see this? I mean, do you know what this is?
This looks
So everybody, you recognize this very easily. So you can easily recognize this. It's the Holocaust. And you can see what exactly it is. Now, my point is that it's so easy to document the Holocaust, but it's different with partition. And I want you to think about what makes it so different. We'll start with Khushwant Singh. And the first paragraph of this book. The summer of 1947 was not like other Indian summers. Even the weather had a different feel in India that year. It was hotter than usual and drier and dustier, and the summer was longer. No one could remember when the monsoon had been so late. For weeks, the sparse clouds cast only shadows. There was no rain. People began to say that God was punishing them for their sins. Some of them had good reason to feel that they had sinned. The summer before, communal riots precipitated by reports of the proposed division of the country into a Hindu India and a Muslim Pakistan had broken out in Calcutta, and within a few months, the death roll had mounted to several thousand. Muslims said the Hindus had planned and started the killing. According to the Hindus, the Muslims were to blame. The fact is, both sides killed. Both shot and stabbed and speared and clubbed. Both tortured. Both raped. And that's probably the biggest difference between the Holocaust and partition. Because in the Holocaust, it's very clear who the bad guys were. But when it comes to partition, everybody had a hand in it. It starts with a scene where this peasant, Nathu, is trying to kill a pig. And it's really horrible. The symbolism, the blood, and the frustration. He's trying to kill the pig and he can't kill it. And there's a bit of blood and it's horrible. I won't read that to you, but what I'm going to read to you is this little thing. As you might know, Tamas got Bhisham Sani the Sahitya Academy Award, and there was a petition to suspend the telecast of the serial. And it went to court and the Supreme Court passed it. I just want to read you this little piece from the Bombay High Court judgment. Tamas takes us to a historical past, unpleasant times when a human tragedy of great dimension took place in this subcontinent. Naked truth in all times will not be beneficial, but truth in its proper light, indicating the evils and the consequences of those evils, is constructive, and that message is there in Tamas. So again, another thing about partition, we don't want to face it, but we really need to. Everyone loves Manto, right? Our favorite. As to where Pakistan was located, the inmates knew nothing. That was why both the mad and the partially mad were unable to decide whether they were now in India or in Pakistan. If they were in India, where on earth was Pakistan? And if they were in Pakistan, then how come until only the other day it was India? One inmate had got so badly caught up in this India-Pakistan-India rigmarole that one day, while sweeping the floor, he dropped everything, climbed the nearest tree, and installed himself on a branch from which vantage point he spoke for 2 hours on the delicate problem of India and Pakistan. The guards asked him to get down. Instead, he went a branch higher, and when threatened with punishment, declared, "I wish to live neither in India nor in Pakistan. I wish to live in this tree." And that's just classic about the madness of partition. There's something else about Manto. He was so much criticized, as you might know. There were these obscenity charges, and a critic even went so far as to say that Manto had desecrated the dead and robbed them of their personal possessions to build a connection. So when we write about partition, are we doing that? Are we desecrating the dead, and are we robbing them of their personal possessions? So when I started working with people who had experienced partition, I thought it was necessary to, not get so involved in the blood and the drama, and to step back and collect facts from individuals and from families about how they dealt with it, what happened to them. And of course, there were 3 distinct periods: what life was like just before partition, what happened during partition, and the story after that. And each one is very, very interesting. So this is one of the people I interviewed, Vimla Malkani, and behind her Sujata, who happens to be sitting here today. And I interviewed her for this book I was writing about the Amils of Sin. And this is one of the very sweet little stories she told me about the Hurra. Now nobody knows what Hurra are, except Madhuri, of course, who knows. So they were these people who belonged to a tribe. And it's a very interesting story, and Vimla told me about how they used to wear these huge ballooning pajamas, and they were, of course, marauders. So when they were caught in the fields, they'd obviously come either to steal something or to kidnap a woman or something like that. And if they were captured, the best way to punish them would be to slip a cat into their pajamas, and that would be a good punishment. Now the point is not that it has anything to do with partition. Here, this is not specific to partition. It's not specific to the Sylvies Story at all. It's just about a quaint thing that happened in the past. And I think that's also quite interesting to record. And I think if we go around Pune and, we will find similar lovely stories. It's something which is not particularly related to partition, but because it comes from our past, it's part of our heritage. I think these kind of things are also good to hang on to. Because most of my work is with Sindhis who went through partition, I'm going to give you some of my insights. And I'm going to start with this from a book which is not a Sindhi book. It's written by this Mr. Dubey, he actually lives in Pune now. And he's in his 90s. And it's a collection of stories about his father. And I was really very lucky to be able to work with him because he is an amazing storyteller. And he told me about his father's work as a social worker in the villages, in the interiors, and about his participation in the freedom movement and what happened after independence. So I'm going to read you a little piece from this book. He was a student at this time, and his father had retired and he was settled in Agra. One day when I was visiting Agra during my holidays, my father came home with a Sindhi family. They were a middle-aged gentleman with his mother, wife, and younger sister, and a little boy, his son. They ate and rested and told us their story. The next morning, they washed their clothes and put them on again, having nothing else to wear. The gentleman went to the wholesale market, bought a large sack of sugar, and sat down with it on the pavement in a crowded bazaar area, selling it slightly cheaper than the other retailers. When the sack was empty, He sold the sack too. They ate our food for just 2 days. By the third day, they had become self-sufficient. Later, the elder son joined them. I don't remember their name, but we used to call the gentleman's sign a Sindhi form of address. They had come to Agra with nothing. Within a few years, they were running their own factory. Most of the refugees settled into lives of their own. Things went back to normal. Now, why I'm telling you this is because I was working with somebody who was helping me to edit this book. And she said to me, Saaz, why have you put this story in? And I said, because it's a good story. So she said, no, but she was a Sindhi herself. She says to me, but he only told you this story because he knows you collect Sindhi stories. I said, yeah, but this is a really good story. It's about partition. I mean, they ate our food for only 2 days and they came with nothing and they had a factory. The whole thing about how he just didn't fast. He went straight out, bought stuff, sold it at a profit, sold the sack. I mean, it's just, it's amazing. That's what I thought. But I realized over a period, and this was one of the big things with, somebody who's so highly educated, did not feel that the Sindhi story is a story. And partly it's because there was no mass murder and the women were sent away to safety. Now, if you ask me, that's the story. So this book, Unboarded Memories, it's a collection which is actually written by Sindhi writers. So immediately after partition, I don't know whether when I say Sindhi writers, it's a phrase that means anything to you. Do you know Sindhi writers?
No, we don't know.
There aren't actually any Sindhi writers, right? It's a kind of extinct breed. But before partition, there was this huge movement of literacy in Sindh. There were a lot of Sindhi writers, and a lot of them most of them wrote in Sindhi, and a lot of them wrote in English as well. Now, these people, they were writers. So they wrote about their trauma. And they wrote it in Sindhi. So Rita Kothari, who is now a professor at Ashoka University, a few years ago, she translated this collection. And it's a lovely collection. It has personal experiences. So I've picked a couple of stories. One of them is from, I'll just read you a small passage from Muhammad the Coach Driver. And it's by someone called Ram Panjwani. I got into the coach, and on the way I saw the police trying to disperse crowds. Such drastic things were happening in Karachi, and I had been so ignorant. When I reached home, Muhammad said to me, "The military forces are arriving. Don't come out of the house. If they impose martial law and curfew, I'll come and stay with you. I will be your guard." Curfew was imposed. For a day or two, the demons of death walked through the streets. I did not need Muhammad at that time because a driver named Sukhi lived with us and he continued to reassure me. Meanwhile, the military took charge of the situation. Terror subsided and Hindu migration intensified. Those who had been determined to live in Sindh under any circumstances were also now desperate to leave. Every morning, Muhammad would visit me. Willingly, he took me wherever I wanted to go. Once, while I was in his coach, he asked me, "Diwan, will you be leaving too?" "What do you desire?" I asked. "You would have to go, Diwan. Outsiders have come. Their motives are not good." "Whatever he wishes me to do," I said. "Diwan, do let me know once you decide." "You want to come to Hindustan with me?" I joked. If someone as loving as you is not valued here, how would a poor man like me be valued there? I will not come to India, but I will certainly come up to the border to see you off. Will you go by plane or ship? Thinking of my belongings, I replied, by ship. Use this poor man's coach to go up to Kiamari docks. I'll feel reassured if I see you off myself. The day of departure did arrive. Muhammad brought me to Kiamari. He took down the belongings from the coach and offering a salam, he said, "May grace follow your footsteps. May Allah give you a long life." I was carrying a sandalwood walking stick with me. I offered it to him. "Keep this as my parting gift. Its fragrance will keep my memory alive for you." Shutting his eyes, he inhaled the fragrance and said, "I'll never forget you. But Diwan, I have a request to make." "Yes, Muhammad," I said. "When you reach India and recall the atrocities committed by Muslims, do please remember this poor Muhammad. Diwan, all human beings are not alike. All Muslims are not bad." I gathered my poor Muhammad into my arms. "My brother Muhammad, you are such a good human being. May Allah keep you safe and happy." A full-grown male was sobbing like a child. I could not control myself either. So the other story, I won't read from there because it's a longish excerpt. It's by Mohan Kalpana, and it's about what happens to him when he's in the refugee camp. Now, he's this very educated person, and he's lost everything. His mother's in hospital, they have no place to live, and all he wants is a meeting with the camp commandant. And he's waiting and waiting, and he gets so frustrated, and then there's, people hit each other, and he gets blood all over him, and finally the camp commandant arrives. And he says, "What's the problem?" So he says, "I just want a place to live." He said, "But why were you fighting with them? Why did they hit you?" He said, "Because I asked them, isn't there a particular time at which the commandant is supposed to arrive, and why is he late?" So the commandant gets really angry with him, and he says, "Are you the governor?" And Mohan Kalpana, being Mohan Kalpana, is able to give a very, very literate and lucid answer. So then the commandant starts feeling sorry for him, and he says, "Okay," he makes him sit down and he tries to counsel him. And, this whole business of dealing with bureaucracy when you're penniless, when you have nothing and you can't express your frustration, it's so beautifully given in this. That's an aspect of partition that I think was really brought out very well here. I also found this book of poems, which is similar. It's poetry written by Sindhi writers and translated by Menka Shivdasani and Anju Makhija. And, I will read you this one thing, which is called D. Das Sippy. D. Das Sippy, the main partner of Dholan Das Sipahi Malani, sees the dark Bombay seascape float into his eyes, feels it devour the Deo's light. In the high-rise building, with no floors, no flats, he imagines an accident, tries to recollect where he lives, where his roots are, who his God is. Surely not Mammon, whom he worships every day. Any reactions to that? It's this businessman, very wealthy, and he's in Bombay now, and he doesn't really have anything. He tries to recollect where he lives, where his roots are, who his God is, because everything is gone. All he's got now is lots of money. And that's one of the things which is important about the Sindhi experience of partition, which is that when they moved, they lost everything, and they didn't know where they were. They had to settle in strange places where everything was different. Another thing which I realized when I was working, interviewing people, is that there was so much. I won't read you this because, or maybe I will. Say it today, say it today. I have no country, the universe I call home. I have no name, a human being I am. I have no Bible, no Gita, no Quran. The earth is my mother, in her I trust. Centuries-old chains have snapped. Are you aware of that? Break it today, break it today. The prison of your mind. Say it today, say it today. The Ali's declaration. So it's a way of achieving liberation, and to me it means that for these people, their gods were just, they had no borders. And the last one from this book is by Motilal Jotwani. Cities ran amok. Streets roared, Allahu Akbar, Har Har Mahadev. In Karachi, on January the 6th, 1948, huddled in a storeroom, we waited with bated breath. The world, it seemed, would come to a sudden end. Hand over the kafirs in your house, the rioters demanded. God's good man, God himself, Allah Dino, lied to them. The people you're looking for sailed to Bombay yesterday. Allah Dino was an ordinary man, Sindhi and Sanskrit Dino in his Muslim name. Allah Dino lied once again. The poor creatures migrated to India, leaving behind their precious belongings. Do you want those instead? And we waited with bated breath. This is another thing that, because after partition people were just too busy getting their lives together, they didn't pass on their stories. And that brings me back to my Facebook post, in which I realized much later this was so inaccurate. It says fleeing for their lives. They weren't actually fleeing for their lives. I mean, they weren't running away. They had made a decision to leave because they knew, my grandfather obviously knew that this was not working out and they had to move on. So, I don't know whether you noticed in the poem I just read to you, he mentioned a date, the 6th of January 1948. And that is a date on which a lot of violence took place in Karachi. Karachi was largely peaceful before that. And it wasn't like, we hear these stories of rivers of blood. It wasn't like that. There was a certain amount of violence, but it wasn't mass butchering. But on this particular date, horrible things happened. 2 trains came in with Sindhi Sikhs, and they were taken to the Gurdwara to wait for the next ship. And the Gurdwara was set on fire. The walls, so everybody inside died. And that day there was a lot of rioting. So it's a day on which a pogrom took place, and that's when everything changed. And people who had planned, who had, like he says in the poem, the people who thought that this is my home, why do I have to leave? That's the day when they knew that they do have to leave, and then they left. But my grandparents actually left before that because they could see what was coming. And so this fleeing for their lives is not correct. And I actually saw this many times. And I'm going to give you a list of what might seem like facetious examples. For example, I had a lot of people telling me my grandfather was mayor of Karachi. And then people would tell me my uncle built the Sakhar barrage. And I was like, gosh, how many people built the Sakhar barrage, And then my grandfather, these are real things that people told me. My grandfather built a temple in Karachi which had the biggest shivling in the world. So I asked someone in Karachi, listen, just go and find this shivling for me. And it wasn't there. I mean, I don't know what happened, because it was the biggest shivling in the world. It would have been hard to pull down, it would have been hard to hide. But anyway. Then I have this lady who keeps telling me I'm the only person alive who saw the Pakistan flag go up in the Sindh Assembly, which is obviously not true. I mean, everybody hasn't died from back then. But some of these things were true. And when you look back, sometimes you don't see things the way they actually were. For example, someone who told me that my grandfather was the mayor of the Karachi Corporation. And I said, no, that's not possible, because your grandfather died in 1933, and the first mayor, which I found from Wikipedia, was in 1934. So he said, well, that's what my mom used to tell me, and I don't know, maybe you're right. So what I found out eventually, after thinking about it a lot, and after really looking for records, which I couldn't find, by the way, that's another thing. The records are all just thrown away. But what I realized is that there was a Karachi Municipal Corporation, and her father definitely was the head of the municipal corporation. The word mayor came in later, maybe in the year in which Wikipedia says that this was the first mayor of Karachi. But he was the head, so, in a way she was right. I also want to just say that being the mayor, it's not like when you're when you think of the Pune Municipal Corporation, God, you don't want to be associated with that. It was different. So, things change. In those days, somebody who was the head of a municipal corporation was like, he was a city father, he was a stalwart, he understood administration, he knew how to lead people. Unfortunately, it's not the same anymore. Similarly, when you say my grandmother got married when she was 14, Ramu, our servant whom we were very fond of, I mean, we're not pedophiles, right? It's just that things were different. So I think this is another really important thing when you look back and try to understand the lives that people led, everything. So another important thing I found is that people don't know a lot of really important things, not just about the cat in the pajamas kind of things, but I realized that freedom, independence was very, very important to the Sindhis. Now, none of us know this. All of us just think that Sindhis want to get lots of money and, they want to cheat people and that kind of thing. Excuse me. Okay. Go on, Gautam.
No.
Come on, tell me what you're thinking. Okay, this is Gautam Idnani. And you know what that means. Okay. So there was so much of commitment to the freedom movement. You've heard of Bhagat Singh, right? Have you heard of Hemu Kalani? Everyone knows Hemu Kalani? No. Well, like 2 people here know Hemu Kalani because there was this guy.
I've heard about it. Yeah, heard about it.
So I've also only ever heard about him because it was long ago. In 1942, he was arrested for, probably, I'm not exactly sure what, but probably blowing up tracks or something like that. And that's why, and then he was sentenced to death. He was captured, sentenced to death for his activities in this Quit India movement. And of course, the citizens petitioned for his release. And they said, yeah, we'll release him. He just has to give us the names of the others who were in the plot. And he didn't. He didn't do that. And eventually they hanged him, and he was 19 years old. So that's Hemu Kalani, who was a martyr. But there were so many others who contributed. A lot of them wrote, and they spread information. And the rich guys sponsored the activities also because they did have a whole lot of people who were working overseas who were very wealthy. And there's so much. Nobody knows this. When I say nobody, that's not technically true. A lot of people do, but most people don't. So this is something which upsets me a lot, because people, when they talk about partition, a lot of people who I interview, they will tell me that when we came from Pakistan or when we came to India, my family's roots are in Pakistan. I heard somebody, like a big businessman, saying on History Channel that my family's roots are in Pakistan. I don't understand that. Pakistan was formed in 1947. Before that, it was all India. You didn't come from Pakistan. You left because Pakistan was formed. And I think these are the kind of things that are so important for people if you want to understand what really happened. You can't keep saying these inaccurate things which create the wrong perception. When I was saying between Holocaust and partition, there is a big difference, but the thing is that Holocaust is easier to write about because the words are there is a narrative. Partition, we're still figuring out stuff. We still haven't got it. As far as Sindhis go, they think that they don't, they feel like, oh, we ran away. They keep saying, we ran away. I mean, it wasn't actually running away. They just said that, okay, fine, this isn't working out. What do we do next, There was that very philosophical and mature way of dealing with things where you don't want to, you just get on with it. Fine, this is what we have. How do we deal with it? What do we do next? Which I think has not been really recognized and appreciated the way. So when I started, I told you that I wanted to look at the three different parts: what life was like before partition, what life was like during, and what life was like after. So when it comes to during partition, the Sindhi story is different, partly because there was less violence. There was less violence. And another thing is that the decision to leave and the way that it was dealt with was absolutely unanimous. It wasn't like one family or one group of families. Everybody did this. They packed their things and they left. They moved to another place and they said, okay, fine, what do we do next? And they just kept moving. So they did, they were looking at the future. And they did this as one. And that, I think, is something that hasn't been appreciated, and it should be, because it was quite a magnificent thing to do. When it comes to before and after, there was a huge difference. And this, again, is something that is not really thought about. It's not really remarked on. It's not realized how different things were. So I'll just read you this little piece, which is actually from a book which I wrote. And it's called Kites and Umbrellas. Just give me a minute to find it. Sito's story, Kites and Umbrellas. One of the things I remember about my childhood in Sindh is that we could go out and fly kites whenever we wanted. Even in the dreaded heat of summer, when we children would be forced to stay indoors away from the blazing afternoon heat, the evenings would be windy. We played gilli danda and spun tops and played marbles outdoors or sitting on top of our large marble dining table. Boys flew kites in the lane outside or on the terraces. My brother Kanna would let me hold his kite so that I too could feel it soar in the wind. There would be competitions, and the older boys would coat their strings with manja to cut their rivals' kites down. We could fly kites all year round because in Sindh it hardly ever rained. There were just a few days of rain when it would pour down and we would stay home from school. This usually happened in July or August when we have our festival Thadari. On that day, no fires are lit in the house, so no food is cooked and special meals are prepared the previous day. This meant there would be time to celebrate, and we would sit around and watch the elders play cards. In Sindh, we had no umbrellas, no raincoats. Nobody in Sindh owned one. I had seen umbrellas in pictures, but the first time I saw a real umbrella was after we arrived in Bombay and started a new life as refugees. We had experienced many changes and seen new and surprising things, and the non-stop pouring of the Bombay monsoon was another thing that we had to get used to. Partly it's about moving to a place where everything is different. You're a kid and everything is changed. And for example, you're used to writing from right to left, and you have to learn how to write from left to right. And food is different, everything is different. So that, I think, is very true for Sindhis, because wherever they went, it was different. Any other part of India, they had familiarity. Their language was spoken on the streets. It wasn't like that for Sindhis. And eventually, the perception of Sindhis, there's a strong monolithic prejudice, and I think this happened a couple of years ago when we were celebrating this big anniversary, 2017, when people started talking about partition in the open for the first time. And I wrote quite a lot of stuff at that time for various mainstream publications. And something I'd written about colleges, the sub-editor kind of inserted this statement, education was one of the sectors that many Sindhis got into, and I found that very, very upsetting. Sindhi phobic, and like very, because it wasn't a sector. They were doing what they were used to doing. They landed up in a new place, and there were so many children who didn't have schools to go to and colleges to go to. There were so many teachers who were out of a job. So they just, in the camps, they sat down, they found a teacher and got the students to sit down. And it wasn't a sector. So, this is something which I felt, the first point is about how different things were in Kites and Umbrellas. And I also want to mention something which I noticed just now because I've read it like after 7 years. It says Gilli Danda. That's not the Sindhi word for it, They'd forgotten. I mean, my mom probably didn't even remember what it was called in Sindh. That was my mother's story, by the way. And the second thing is what happened is that people didn't realize, who these people are. They were just these people who came and then, they started making money. So why do we have to bother about them? So, because there was tremendous material progress. And if you look at any list of the richest people in the world, there's going to be a Sindhi on that list. But there's also tremendous disconnect with the past. And the language is gone. Yeah, you do find people who can speak the language, and they're proud that they can speak the language because they are so few. But they can't read. And the real treasures of the language are in writing, they're in the poetry, the Sufi poetry of Sindh. The end. This is a page from a book I wrote recently, the same one which I mentioned earlier, which I interviewed Vimla Malkani for. And I like this page because there are 3 different things on it. One is about Karachi had a cultural organization called Stars and Strings. It was a part of the Rabindranath Literary and Dramatic Society. Who would ever imagine that Karachi had a thing like that? But it's true, there was a lot of connection between Karachi and Calcutta. There was a lot of influence coming from the Brahma Samaj. And that's why Karachi, Sindh had schools for girls as early as in the 1880s, which was very rare across, it wasn't that common. The second thing is this photo, this beautiful photo of these very, very prosperous and smart boys and men. I got it from this. So this section is Ram Malani's biography. Ram Malani died 2 years ago. But before that, he'd given me a document which he had been working on, which was his memoirs. A lot of it was personal, but I made a summary of it for this book. And then he also, his daughter gave me this album. Nobody knew who these guys were. It was like really, even though there's an inscription there, and some of the people were familiar to me because this is a small community, people know each other. Right at the end, just before we published the book, we found out, and that too, the boy sitting at the left, I had a feeling that somebody who I came across much later might know because he mentioned somebody else in this picture. And when I sent it to him, he said, "I'm sorry, I can't recognize anyone." And after that, I asked him, "Could it be your father?" And then he said, "Yes, that was my dad." So that's how we found out. But that's how these things happen. And the last thing is this really lovely story, it's my favorite story. Will you read it for me, please? Because I can't see it from where I'm sitting. Thanks.
Sure. An uncle of my father. I still find it difficult to believe that nearly 70 years have gone by since I moved to Bombay, a momentous span of time for me and all of the country. I remember the joy of achieving our independence, the loud shouting in the streets and bursting of crackers at midnight, quickly followed by the horror of partition, loss of millions of lives and the loss of my homeland, Sindh. Millions were uprooted. They lost everything they possessed and had to start afresh. I remember one particular individual who had a fortune to his name in Karachi, an uncle of my father. He lost all of his wealth and was reduced to begging. He used to come to my office at the beginning of each month to collect a small amount of rupees 10 or so. I learned much later that he used to go straight off to a restaurant and enjoy the kind of meal that he could once taken for granted. Rupees 10 could buy quite a lot way back in 1955.
We have to look at what we've learned. At least I like to look at what I think I've learned from all this. One thing which I've seen almost everyone I interviewed, and including some of the pieces which I read to you today, you'll recognize this. It wasn't just a period when people were fighting. It was also a period when people were going out of their way to help each other. And there are cases of people who put their own lives at risk. And this page 345, which I'm not going to read, is about a Muslim family swearing on the Quran that there's no Hindu in their house, which is like such an amazing thing to do. So I think we need to keep this in mind when we talk about partition. And then the question, of course, who were the real villains then? And of course, I have an answer to that. And this is what I think. The real villains were the greed for power and the greed for money.
Very good.